All right, guys, we have finished up our Schiller discussion. We've played some music, and as many of you know who listen to this is typically where we do more of the improvised discussion about the intersection of philosophy and music. For the past couple of weeks, we've been working off CJ's blog, but in order to capture sort of the spontaneous spirit of philosophical discussion, we decided to kind of just let it, to really have a very small nucleus to be our departure point. And I would say it comes from a recurring observation of CJ's, specifically this notion of how philosophers, though they may seem to be isolated individualists, and they seem to be sort of willing in a new philosophical system every time one of these geniuses appears upon the planet. What we've learned in our study of Nietzsche and Schiller, and what we'll see with Barth and anybody else that we study, is that there's really a complex interaction of minds. And perhaps you could even say that we are in interaction with these individuals, and maybe someone will be commenting about what we do one day. For better or for worse.
Yes.
For better or for worse. We're not going to say we're great. But I think this has really, from what I understand of how you communicated to me, this has really brought home the point that the same thing is going on in music. That there are no musical geniuses that operate in isolation, that regardless of how great or small the interaction is, there are a tremendous amount of interactions that contribute to the musical genius of somebody. There's someone, and what I found to be, and that is something I think I've always understood, okay? What I find to be a really fertile area of philosophical research, and then I'm going to shut up and let you take it, is, so we've got these parallel lines of philosophy and music, neither operating in a vacuum, but this communication between musicians on one side and between philosophers on the other. Mm-hmm. What I find to be really fascinating and philosophically significant is how philosophers will determine revolutions in music or affect musicians, and those philosophical ideas will inspire new conceptions of music. And similarly, how certain musicians, certain composers and things like that, will affect philosophers and their systems, or something to that effect. So not only are the philosophers and the musicians in a community of their own kind, but they're in a community with each other too. And I think of some very notable examples of that.
We just did some. I mean, yeah. Wagner and Nietzsche.
Wagner and Nietzsche. Schopenhauer and Wagner. I go on and on, but that's how I understand the issue. And I've highlighted kind of what I think is the rich area of philosophical intrigue, but I don't know if that captures the entire issue. So I'm going to hand it over to you. Did I get it right?
I think you did. And this inquiry, I need to at least cite one book if anybody wants to check it out. It's by Andrew Durkin, Durkin, and the book is called Decomposition, a Music Manifesto. And it goes into this idea of the isolated creative genius, and at least trying to elaborate on that and say, well, actually it's more collaborative genius, if you want to call it anything, and that different people come into play in this world, or in this artistic world, than just Beethoven, than just Mozart. That Beethoven had many people to help him, that Mozart did, whoever you want to call it, did have all these people. And that's not to say, and I think this is an interesting part for me at least, is that whether it reconciles with the idea of creative genius, where maybe some people would feel that, oh, so you're saying that Schopenhauer isn't a genius? You're saying Nietzsche, it wasn't a great philosopher because they used other things? I think it's maybe worthwhile to try to reconcile the fact of great men and of how people need each other. And I think that's something that maybe sometimes philosophy, I don't know, you see maybe just it's heavily individualistic. It's heavily like, oh, it's us versus them, or one person versus the masses. when sometimes, like we were talking off camera, that sometimes it takes the masses for that one person to get the idea of us versus the masses. So for me, that intersection that you just said of a field and another and music, so like philosophy and music, is really fascinating. And I'm wondering maybe if in this discussion we can explore, along with what you just said, at least how we can reconcile an individualistic view of artistic creation and still at the same time realize that you need a little help from your friends and that that's okay.
You know, it's really fascinating as I heard you talk about this, because I think we have to sort of recontextualize great men. Mm-hmm. And by great men, I mean that with a capital M. I mean humanity. So that includes women as well. Mm-hmm. I think the thing is, when we do contextualize philosophers as having all these sort of influences and working with a community and conversing with shopkeepers to other academics that actually sort of gave that were generative for their philosophical ideas. If we take something away from their greatness, if greatness is something we impose upon them, and I think what's really fascinating to me is that as professional philosophy has advanced, right, is that the era of the great man has declined. You could make the case that hundreds of years ago, and thousands of years ago, when philosophy was still sort of a nascent, infant, juvenile, middle-aged state, that it was perhaps easier to be a great man, to protrude from humanity and be like, I brought this into existence. I think the situation is with modern philosophy, with some exceptions, is that generally there's been a massive leveling in professional philosophy, and it's incredibly difficult for someone to protrude like they would have in the past. You may have an individual of similar intellect to Kant now, who's contemporaneous, but because he's standing on the shoulders of so many giants, he's reached the stratosphere. There may not be anywhere else for him to go.
To get into the semantics of that, do you think that maybe that change is through also just how we talk about these thinkers or the thoughts themselves? Just to get into semantics here, I mean, we think of like Aristotelian, Platonic, Kantian, and then I don't know if this was a shift, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but then we get to more ideas like existential thinkers, or we think of like maybe the bigger thoughts rather than just like a specific philosopher. Am I judging that?
Yeah, I think it's a major question about where to. Yeah, I mean, it's not. I mean, great movements are driven by great philosophers, and I think the question is, have we reached in the arc of philosophy, just like we've talked about, every human being has a life arc and every book has an arc. Does the philosophical discipline have an arc, and is it in its golden years? I mean, is it sailing off into the sunset? And I think it's easy to pronounce the. I think it's easy to pronounce the obituary for a philosophical discipline, but just as when we do that, I wonder what comes next. Like, it seems like philosophy, at least professionally, has reduced itself to epistemology and logic crunching and things that really aren't motivated by the big sort of existential questions that motivated so many philosophers to get into philosophy to begin with. And that's probably why you're seeing a lack of interest in the discipline. You're seeing it's sort of reduced itself to.
So do you think that has to do with like kind of like the communal sort of thing, where it's like it's kind of reduced itself to isolation, where it's only a couple people, and I say a couple people, a couple hundred or so people that are just interested in these logic crunching exclusive sort of concepts that maybe, like you said, a shopkeeper or anybody else would not be interested in, or something that's not in their stratosphere or in their mode of thought, that that maybe, like we're saying, this whole idea of isolation, is that, do you think, leading some kind of way to decline, I guess?
I think the decline is because of too much community. I think I think as philosophy has become more professional and more like you have fewer outsiders, you have fewer people going it alone, and you have fewer people. Philosophy has been is a discipline more driven by ethos now. I think you have certain regulatory commissions that say this is a legitimate way to think and this is not, and it's a sort of a controlled body now, and so you have very incremental progress, and you'll have some warring factions between Aristotelians and Kierkegaardians and Hegelians and Kantians and whatever Ians, right? But they don't seem to. There doesn't seem to be the man of genius that can sort of have these sort of piercing breakthroughs, and I wonder. I wonder if that is because there has been an academic culture that suppresses innovation. And I
do you see?
I don't know. I don't know where it's going next, and I don't know if. And I think this may be a point of distinction between either a point of distinction or a point of similarity with music, because we're, as far as these parallel lines go, we've been talking about the timeline of philosophy entirely. I think we're either watching a star die, right, with philosophy, in terms of research and new insights and things like that, or we're waiting for that next great revolutionary insight.
I think we're noticing a parallel in some way.
So maybe before we speculate on that, talk about the parallel with music.
I think it's.
Where do you think music is related to this?
I think people have scenes, or I mean, you can relate to this too. You might have more insight than I would, but you have scenes or certain types of movements in regards to music, whether that be genre or style of music. And that can go on for a while until it almost just becomes dogma, and maybe people feel like they're held back by it, or that, well, this can only go so far, and that we need to break free from just making the same kind of music or the same kind of, I guess with philosophy, like mode of thinking. We have to go to something else.
We have to destroy the template.
Right.
We have to destroy the dogma.
Right. I mean, it's almost like, after World War II, where it's just like, there's that, I can't remember who said it, but it's just like, and I'm just paraphrasing, where it's just like, we can't really write the same kind of poems after Auschwitz.
Yeah.
Let alone poems.
Yeah.
After Auschwitz, that just implies a totally new approach to how things are done. So outside events, and then even events inside that field itself. But again, I think we're kind of implying that everything kind of seeps into an endeavor, whether that be philosophical or artistic, that these outside events, like that, something can go on for a long period of time. Like maybe with philosophy, maybe everybody's isolated until some catastrophic event has to bring everybody, not so much bring everybody together, but make them reach out to other people. Well, maybe that's the internet. Maybe that's something else.
I would say the internet, for all its virtues and what it's done. I mean, look, we're using the internet right now to bring philosophy to people, so I'm not going to sit here and say that the internet is bad. But one bad aspect of the internet is it has totally devalued music, right? You got the era of the rock star who is making tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, with notable exceptions, is over.
Sure.
And the internet, like professional philosophy, has had this leveling effect. It's brought, it's equalized, and it's torn down this great ideal.
So in a sense, it's like that, like if you parallel, or if you, I guess you use that template of that quote where it's like, oh, how can you write a poem after Auschwitz? It's like, how can you make music after YouTube? Or how can you make a living with music after YouTube or after the internet, I guess, if you really wanted to say that.
If you come up with something sensational, you might be able to.
Yeah.
And that's the thing is...
People do, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the thing is you can... So I think we're in similar points with both music and philosophy. I think you had professional philosophy having this leveling effect on great men. I think you've had the internet having this
or anything, any outside effect have a leveling effect.
Yeah, having this leveling effect on musicians. And we've speculated within the music timeline and its arc. Mm-hmm. We've speculated, we've talked about unrepeatable performances in previous podcasts. We've talked about evolving albums and maybe those are like things that people participate in a communitarian level, and there's a million iterations of them. Mm-hmm. And we're going to see, at least in music, I think we're going to see a new manifestations of music. Even what we do in the basement, we just kind of let these unedited things up on the internet. We don't even know where they're going to go, but sort of evolution will sort of work its course. I wonder how that happens in a professional philosophy field. We've sort of talked, and maybe what we do at Noetic and some of the other stuff. Maybe this is where the new great men will be born. And I'm not saying we are.
Or whether even the concept of great men will even be relevant to what we're doing. Which I guess is part of the discussion as well, where maybe it's not genius, but maybe as Brian Eno terms, maybe it's scenius, where maybe it's more about the collective genius of a community of people, and that maybe it's not so much about being a genius, but of being a useful and interesting node inside a greater network.
I think that's the thing. Yeah, I think that's the thing, is that I think philosophers in general have been terrible communicators for their discipline. Another reason why its shores are receding. And I think, for this very short period of time where there have been multimedia ways to document philosophers, there are some really powerful people who've done a great deal to advance the interest in philosophy. Mm-hmm. There are very few recordings of this person, but of a guy named Walter Kaufman, who he was I don't know what his stature is as a philosopher necessarily. I don't know if it's settled within the philosophy community, because he did a great deal of interpretation of existentialists like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. But he was such a poetic and profound speaker. The very few recordings that exist of him from the 50s and 60s, I mean, they're gold. They're works of art. And really, in my attempts to record, I've spent this past week recording lectures for Noetic and hearing myself cobble together these things on these whole books. Man, it's hard. And boy, do I have so much to learn. And I look at people like Walter Kaufman and how he just turned that into an art form, and how he brought even through those limited means to the discipline. There are other people who have done it too. I mean, I found a lot of them through sort of putting together some of these materials. But he's one that comes to mind most immediately. I mean, Simone de Beauvoir used to go on talk late night talk shows and stuff like that. She was fantastic. Ayn Rand used to do some stuff too. I know she's kind of an anathema in philosophical circles, but
was the public intellectual, I guess, is what you're kind of implying here.
Yeah, there have been a few. There have been a few who have done it.
So are you calling for that, or are you at least calling for maybe that philosophy shouldn't be isolated, but should be taking in different mediums? I guess what we're saying, having a more holistic approach, where maybe it's not so much about just being a strict Kantian or Hegelian or whatever, but taking everything that's around us, whether it be the internet, documentaries, sitcoms, all these different things, and trying to use them in a way that might bring these philosophical concepts into a different light.
Most definitely, because the thing is the way that professional philosophy works right now is that you have people spending their precious years trying to get papers published, getting books published, and things like that. And they're not reaching anybody. It's falling on deaf ears. Maybe a few other. I'm not trying. Look, I know that I'm probably saying really hurtful things when I say that, and I probably shouldn't be saying it. It's probably unwise for me to say that. But what they could have a greater influence if they turn to those other media. But I think there are different. But I don't want to suppress that activity because there's very important research that goes on by doing that incremental advancement. So I don't want to say that people have wasted their time by doing it, but I do think that there should be a more culturally holistic approach.
And that requires, I mean, I think like we're saying is that you should take from different people, or at least like include people in your life that can bring a different perspective, or at least do different things. 'Cause I'm sure for you, especially working with this platform, you've brought in so much insight from various people who have.
I just I just let Socrates be my guide, you know. And seriously, I mean, that's precisely what Socrates did. You know, he didn't. I mean, there weren't PhDs really. I mean, there wasn't. You know, he would eke out philosophical conversations from anyone that he could find, be they a politician or a slave boy or anybody in between, you know. And I think the problem with professional philosophy is it does too much navel gazing. It doesn't do enough. It doesn't recognize the profound contributions that every man, woman, and child can really make. It has become obsessed with great men. It has become obsessed with cultural standards. It has become obsessed with certain modes of distribution of those ideas. And it is, to its own detriment, has neglected the truths that other people can give us.
Do you think music is the same, or do you think maybe philosophy could learn something from a music kind of approach where it's just more kind of about the scene and how everybody contributes in their own way, where, I mean, you'll have, you know, people that make the music or like the bands, and you'll have the people that house the bands, and you'll have the guy that makes the fanzine, and then you'll have the person that sort of does the blog, the person that interviews the people, whereas like you have all these people kind of, and then one person makes the dinner. You have all these different kind of people contributing to a larger cause, or maybe, I mean...
Yeah, I think you want to do that. I think you want to encourage that. And I think it's pretty myopic to say that to be a philosopher is to publish or perish. You know? And that really, that professional philosophy should look at a profound schematization and hierarchy that really doesn't elevate one over the other, but that there's a role for everybody, and that a similar sort of culture should be built up, and that the great man has he's indebted to the translator. Like, I think something we talked about in a lot of our podcasts is how little acclaim translators get. Like, and I would love it. I would absolutely love it if there was someone listening to this right now and we have celebrated the translator, and they want to go into translating philosophical texts now. That is such an essential aspect for scholarship. No. And so then if you build up all these other careers around philosophy, okay, so not only are you going to have programs expand, right? And then you have more jobs open up and more cultural acceptance and things like that. Is that maybe then you can talk about getting so many more people into it that you can talk about really interesting scholarly revolutions. Because right now you're talking about a luxury class of individuals that are very incestuous, right? The circles are very small, and they're really only interacting with themselves. And I mean, what do we know about evolution when a population remains closed off? And I think I've been listening to I've been listening to Will Durant's The Story of Philosophy, and there's a chapter in there about Herbert Spencer, and he applied the theory of evolution not only to biological mechanism, but atoms, the stars, social movements. I think you can kind of say the same thing when philosophy circles the wagons like that.
Or when whether it be music
or
movement,
music too.
Yeah, anything, yeah.
That you're gonna see. I mean, just as you would see inbreeding in a secluded population, I think you can start to see intellectual inbreeding.
I think that's
And
very, very true. Do you see that even with, I mean, because you've been to various music scenes, or at least ones bigger than I have, at least like in Athens and whatnot. Have you noticed any kind of musical, dare we say, inbreeding, or at least a small scene where it's just almost kind of suffocating? Can you talk about any of that, or at least articulate or extrapolate on that idea?
Yeah, and I want to qualify the statements I just made. I was painting with a real broad brush, and I'm not saying that there aren't people. I'm not saying that anyone who does professional philosophy is like participating in inbreeding. I'm not trying to say that, but I'm saying it's not.
No, I know what you mean, but it's just like existing in a vacuum. I think, like we're saying, is a sort of problem that you'll suffocate yourself. Maybe inbreeding is not the right analogy, but maybe you're suffocating.
I would just say
thought and new ideas.
An injection of new industries and things like that would be very good for the discipline. I care very much for philosophers and the discipline and the promulgation of philosophy. So
how about music for you, though? I guess like music.
Do I think that music can become suffocating? Yeah, I mean, I think that happens all the time. At first, it can be really good, right? Because it can definitely
establish a sound,
identity. You're greater together than you are on your own. So like when whether it be like a punk scene or a jazz scene or something like that. But then like a lot of things, it runs its course. If these become graven idols, and we just worship them all the time, if the greats become people that we always have to imitate and become disciples of and acolytes of, then you start talking about suffocation and no injection of new ideas. And I think that's going to be the big thing is we've got to be careful not to turn philosophers into graven images.
I think we're getting to a really interesting point in this discussion because I'm curious about how, okay, so it's like you said, okay, community is good in the beginning.
Yes.
And then at some point, as it goes on, it gets worse. And then, the oxygen is kind of taken out, and that we're just kind of just like, putting the bag over it and just kind of like twisting it and just like suffocating. So I'm curious as to what we can do to stop that and to reconcile the idea of community without it suffocating any kind of progress. Would that mean then just having a community that maybe on the onset connects to maybe vaguer or larger ideals? It is not so specific, where maybe in a musical sense, it could be maybe not really a genre, but just sort of just like, we're all inclusive and, we revolve around these certain places, and maybe an ethos of DIY or just being open to any kind of style, like I said before, and then just going from there. Or maybe with philosophy, maybe, it's just kind of a more vague sort of generalized sort of thing, where maybe it's like a discussion platform or like a forum or something like that, and then just like go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think so.
I guess that's.
So you're looking for partial solutions or something like that.
Partial solutions, or maybe like ways that we can combat this, because I think we've identified the problem here as a kind of community is good in the start, but then it can kind of suffocate. Yeah. So it's like, I guess we're trying to kind of, okay, so like how do we reconcile that problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think like we said before, I think the idea of I think we've come up with some good solutions, and I think we can come up with some more. The unrepeatable performances, the evolving albums for music stuff. I think anything we can do to get us uncomfortable, anything we can do to tear down those idols and to essentially cross-pollinate, if you want to keep using evolutionary language, and I think we probably should. It seems like there's sort of this vivacity of life force that goes through all the disciplines, through all music and stuff like that. Maybe I'm just reading too much Spencer lately or whatever. I think I don't know. I mean, something I would love to see. I love seeing like bills, like live performances where acts aren't supposed to go together. Like I love it. Like when like I know usually people try to book within genre, like where they have like well, we're jazz bands. We need another jazz band. We need another jazz band. Jazz band. But like ideally, if you want to have some sort of, if you want to exercise the audience and exercise the musicians that are all sort of participating in it and stuff like that, I think you could start by embracing the concept of mixed bills, and so you have like metal, jazz, folk all in one night or something like that. And I think similarly, you can expand the concept of the band too. I think you can talk about, the band. We've talked about maybe an idea of where the band isn't limited to the stage, where the band becomes the individuals that are there that night, right? Where the audience is included in some way. And then you sort of, anything you can do to increase unpredictability in some way, I think is going to be good. I have a friend.
So then I guess you have nothing. Sorry. So then I guess you have nothing to create an idol off of.
I think you got to tear down the idols.
Do you think that maybe sometimes we create an idol of the process then, where maybe everybody's just like, yeah, chance, man, or I don't know, maybe philosophy, maybe.
Yeah, I think that can happen too. Yeah. I think it's like anything. I mean, the pendulum can swing the other way, and if it becomes all process, then
because you think like logic crunching, like
right,
that kind
right.
Of like, yeah.
You'll starve the human mind. Just to reference what we talked about in Schiller, we starve the human mind of form. It all becomes unintelligible babble at that point. I think we want to maybe take some cues from Schiller and try to break down the formulas that break down the challenge our concepts, by sort of overflowing them with more raw centrist data. I think that's probably something to be strive for there. And as far as philosophy goes, philosophy's all form. Philosophy, if we use Schiller to help with this evolutionary advancement so that we can resuscitate both music and philosophy, I mean, philosophy's black and white on the paper. Like, where's the sensuality in philosophy now? I mean,
people would argue it's in the words, right?
Yeah, but I'm telling you, I mean, philosophers are not exactly known for their beautiful phraseology. I think it's hard in academic journals to get poetic, to write in an engaging way, because it's seen as a form of it's seen as extraneous. There's such an urge within philosophy to approximate science, and I'll tell you this: science is the idol that has to be torn down. Just like in Nietzsche's big on this. So if we give up this idea that philosophy ought to be a science, that it's something else, and I think what we do here illustrates it's something elseness. Like when we have a philosophy conversation, are we doing science? Or are we engaging in an activity that makes our lives meaningful? And I think if we can get closer to that and then marry it to sensual representations, like PBS is doing these wonderful things. I was showing them to Jordan the other day, and I'll show them to you too. And everybody should go check them out. They're really wonderful. It's PBS has this thing called they're doing like digital shorts, like Blink on Blink or something like that, where they take these fragments of conversations that are in the public archives or whatever. So the conversation with David Foster Wallace, our conversation with Carl Sagan, or a conversation with, I mean, really anyone that you'd be interested in hearing from. They take that and then they do like these really awesome animations and interpretations, sort of taking what Richard Linklater did in what's the movie, The Waking Life, that I enjoy so much. And they're doing that. I think that's one way to introduce people to the formal aspect of philosophy. I think music has a role. They do a little bit of that. They involve some music in these digital shorts. Cinema. The cinema is such a fertile ground to play out philosophical ideas. What I really want to do one day with the Noetic stuff is I want to create philosophical documentaries. Like, I want us to, take this podcast and the idea that sort of came out of this or whatever, distill it down to like, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes, and maybe put them all together and be able to work hand in hand with cinematographers and try to illustrate these things with sunsets and knolls and trees and animals and skyscrapers and everything else. Like, I think, cinema is just such an undiscovered and fertile place for philosophy. And not just there. I mean, I'm sure other art forms too, but I think you could probably say what's going on in both scenes, both the music and the philosophy scene, would benefit a lot from what we've said about Schiller.
I think so too. It almost reminds this. You're extrapolating on this reminds me of a little thing Albert Camus said, and he said, "If you want to be a philosopher, go write a novel." In the sense where it's like, mean? I think he meant in the sense that when you deal with a novel, you're kind of writing about a problem that occurs, and you're writing about a person that has to go through something, and that character believes in something that can get him through that problem, or he has to find a way to make sense of what is happening to his life. That in that process of writing about a certain person, or to have to write about a story, is to, in some sense, create a worldview, or to create a certain way of seeing things. That's at least how I interpreted it. And as we know, Camus wrote many philosophical novels, or like novels that were based on philosophical ideas.
You know who did this exceptionally well? Well, Kierkegaard, obviously, but the Russians. The Russians don't really have.
Yeah.
They don't really have. I mean, this is also the translator problem. Yeah. They could have, but we just don't know because it hasn't been properly translated. But they don't have celebrated philosophers.
All we have are their novelists.
Their celebrated philosophers are all novelists.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
And maybe so maybe that's where philosophy needs to go. Maybe instead of churning out another tome on Kierkegaard, someone needs to go write a novel.
Right, and I think people have done that before. I mean, even look to science fiction, where they take these big ideas and they put it through a lens of, if you take the big idea, the idea of the other, or of dealing with people that are different than you, or dealing with different cultures. How much science fiction deals with that, right? Going to another planet and having to deal with another life form. Taking that idea, I think maybe we just need to kind of look at it like that, like it's like Camus said, if you want to be a philosopher, maybe it's go write a novel, go make a documentary, go make an album.
Yeah.
Where maybe doing all these other things can help, and maybe it's the inverse too. If you want to be a musician, go read philosophy.
Oh,
if you want to be a musician, go make a cake. All these different things have influence on us, where it's like they can help us be a musician, and we just have to kind of view it differently.
I don't know if you know this, but did you know that C.S. Lewis wrote sci-fi?
I believe it.
He wrote a space trilogy. So I think that's really interesting too. I hate to draw it to a close. It's getting so late, and I have to travel tomorrow.
That's okay.
Yeah, but I look. I think we came up with a lot of good stuff there. All right, you cool? All right, thanks guys. Thanks for listening.